Victoria.
From a time of grand dreams came a time of great struggle. Peter Yeldham's The Alien Years.
She believes she's in love with him.
I'm old enough to know what love is.
A story of flourishing love and cruel injustice.
I do not want your money.
A magnificent new Australian miniseries starring John Hargraves, Victoria Longley and Christopher Waltz.
Father, don't call him a bludger. I won't have it.
Their times of happiness and of hardship. The Alien Years premieres soon on ABC.
If I go to a bomber command function and see a lot of men there, it's easy to think, oh, it was a great old time, a lot of us got through. But then you've got to remind yourself that that's the tip of the iceberg of the dead.
The 54 pilots I trained with at Sydney and then Naranda and Canada and so on, after the first year, there's only 7 left.
I mourn for their youth, that we have had the bonus of these 40 years, and it is a bonus paid for with the lives of very young men.
The most chilling thing of a military funeral is the firing of the shots from rifles and the shudder that goes through you, and the poor father falling forward and burying his face in his hands and almost wanting to fall into the grave after his son.
The storm was yet to come. On the morning of September the 3rd, 1939, the English countryside was bathed in golden sunshine.
We're flying, I think, at about 2,000 or 3,000 feet. A beautiful day. And sitting there in the cockpit doing nothing but pass the time away, and the airplane looked after itself. And the radio operator sat behind the pilot. Passed up a message back. We had no intercommunication in the aircraft at that time. Passed up a little message, and written on it was, "War declared 11:02 hours." And we were suddenly struck with the realization that everything that we'd been told was about to come to pass. And I remember going to my room just for a moment to sit down and think about it. And I had a mirror, a dressing table in this small room in the mess I was living in. And I looked in the mirror and I thought to myself, you're an idiot. Why aren't you back in Australia? You've got no right to be here with the war on.
Keith Kaufman was one of several hundred pilots who had transferred from the Australian to the peacetime British Air Force. Before the war ended, more than 4,000 young Australians were to be killed on bomber operations from Britain, more than 1,500 New Zealanders, nearly 10,000 Canadians, and almost 40,000 men of the British Royal Air Force. No other unit in either World War was to suffer such catastrophe or to provoke so much controversy.
It was Bomber Command, really, that was the only arm that was in a position to make an attack on the Western Front. It was the predominant force for a number of years, all the way from Scandinavia down to the Iberian Peninsula.
On the 10th of May 1940, Hitler's armies dashed towards France. On the 14th, the Luftwaffe bludgeoned neutral Holland with a raid on Rotterdam which killed 1,000 civilians. They had 3,500 warplanes in the sky. Confronting them, the British had slightly more than 200 obsolescent light bombers.
About 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the signal came through and we put bombs on for the first time. the French wouldn't allow us to have bombs in the aerodrome before that. And as they rolled out, there were 6 planes, and everybody in the squadron was there. Everybody, cooks, clerks, everybody. And I remember watching them take off and thinking, you know, we've gone to war at last after 7 months. And we waited and waited. We were fit, as you see, waiting to see them in. None of them come back. And then at 6 o'clock, we sent another 6. And 3 of them come back, and they were riddled. By nightfall, we knew that we'd lost the squadron. They just went out and never came back.
In the operation of the 14th, when the remaining 71 battles out of the 128 that we'd had on the 10th were sent against the bridges at Sedan, and 24 of us returned.
As a practical man, I tell you that the need of the hour is desperate. Without the help of the young men of Australia, we cannot win this war. The Air Force asks you to do a man's job, to take your place alongside the gallant pilots, observers, and air gunners who are now fighting your battle. The Huns were whipped in the first battle for Britain. We have the finest planes in the world to drive them back, to smash them, and to blast their cities. We want you to fly these planes. If you are between the ages of 18 and 32, the Royal Australian Air Force wants to see you urgently. Come on, do a man's job.
The Empire Air Training Scheme was to rally young men from every country to Britain's defence. She now stood alone, an embattled island. The only weapon with which she could strike back at Hitler's frightening regime was her bomber force. But in those early bombing exchanges, Britain took much more than she dealt out. Coventry in November 1940. London, raided on 57 consecutive nights. The cost? Some 18,000 of her citizens' lives. Brian Moorhead, an Australian living in London, wrote to his mother, "Makes a man feel rather ruthless and vicious, although I suppose plenty in Germany are in the same boat. I'm sure you'd sooner see me in it than out of it. We've all got to pull our weight." They were sentiments shared by Australians still at home.
In the country, if there's a big fire starts in the next man's property or somewhere there, everybody downs tools and goes and helps him put the fire out. And to me, there was a fire that started in Europe, and I was just going to help them put it out.
I think the old chant on Monday morning at school pretty well summed us up. I love God and my country, I honour the flag, I serve the king, and cheerfully obey my parents, teachers, and the law. We were a cheerfully obedient generation. We didn't ask many questions.
Our sovereign Lord the King. As a member of the Air Force Reserve. As a member of the Air Force Reserve. Of the Commonwealth of Australia. Of the Commonwealth of Australia. And that I will...
Australia may well be proud of her sons in the Empire Air Scheme. And it is to these lads she will look to keep the enemy from her shores. And they mean to.
So help me God. So help me God.
I was a miner in Mount Isa, and I tried to join up before the war broke out, actually. I'd gone on a holiday down to Brisbane and tried to join the Air Force, and I got a nice letter saying that there was no room for me.
You had to have an intermediate certificate education to be aircrew, and that was all I had, but I had to wait. You just, you know, like I think you're getting into the Melbourne Cricket Club or something.
And we had to have references in triplicate from your schoolmaster, local clergyman, and employer.
I can always remember the recruiting officer asked me what I wanted to be in the Air Force. And I asked him what he had, and I said, "Oh, I'll be a gunner." He said, "Why a gunner?" And I said, "Oh, I'll be a navigator." He said, "Why a navigator?" I said, "Well, I'll be a pilot then." So that's what happened. I became a pilot.
The first stages of training were in Australia, where some remained until training was completed. But many more were sent to Empire Air Training Scheme schools in Canada on their next step to the war.
The course was excellent. It was hard slog. They started us on it from the very first day we got there. The navigators were split into pairs for their training. We were training on old Anson aircraft, and I was paired up with a young article clerk from Cowra, New South Wales, Max Bryant, who was then only 20.
Don Charlwood and Max Bryant had sailed from Melbourne on the 18th of September 1941. On their navigators course in Canada, there were 24 other Australians. 20 graduated. 18 went to Bomber Command. Only 5 of the 18 survived to see Australia again.
I was lucky in that my mother was Australian. And when she said to we girls one day, would you like to meet some Australians, we jumped at the idea. We thought it'd be marvelous. So she rang the camp and asked for 2 boys to come to supper.
The 13th of January 1942 was Max's 21st birthday. The girls and their mother made sure he had a good time. For Don and Nell, it augured their lifetime together. For Max, time was running out. Although life remained happy, and the company always congenial.
I enjoyed Canada to the detriment of my course results, really. I was doing well on course until I became rather seriously involved with a Canadian lass whom I later married. And then I tended to go downhill a bit and only just get through.
Of course, we took the boys skating. That was something. And that was hard work, believe me. You know, they couldn't stand up, and we had to pick these rather heavy men up off the ice, and we no sooner get them on their skates, and they were down again. And believe me, that's not easy when you're on skates yourself, you know.
Other Australians came through as wireless air gunners. Among them was Ian Robb from Camberwell, Victoria, with a tremendous zest for life and an ancestral devotion to the kilt, the bagpipes, and all things Scottish. He enjoyed the sport, the fun in the snow, and the Christmas of 1941. As the new year began, he wrote in his diary, "I have fallen into a fine service, plenty of work to do, and we all enjoyed the year. Canada has been a great experience. But I still hope 1942 finishes this war." After 7 months in Canada, they were awarded their flying badges and graduated as sergeants, their technical training complete. There were still months of battle training to undergo in England. A few who had topped their courses were made officers in Canada. That status would be granted to others if they survived their first tour of 30 trips with Bomber Command, but not many managed it. 2/3 were still sergeants when they went missing. They arrived in England from training schools all over the world, most of them from Canada, but some directly from Australia.
The snow was just starting to thaw out. The trees were bare. As a matter of fact, I thought they were dead. I didn't realise they were deciduous trees in that day as an ignorant Australian. And it was a bit, wasn't very good really, because we'd been pretty warm, and all of a sudden to come from the warm climes of the west coast of Africa, our last port of call was Freetown, and then to arrive in England up in Liverpool, because Liverpool is not the most presentable place in the world. It's not very picturesque, you might say. And with these so-termed dead trees, I wasn't impressed at all. And I grew to love England. I still love England.
Ian Robb arrived a little later in the spring. As he journeyed to the Australian reception depot at Bournemouth on the south coast, he noted in his diary, "It is grand, green country like home, with a beautiful outlook onto the sea."
England had an extraordinary familiarity to us. I think this was possibly because our parents had talked a lot about it, even though very, very few of our parents had ever been there. Many of our parents still referred to it as home.
Well, I'm very glad to welcome you fellas here. In a minute or two, I'm going to give you a parcel from the Australian Comforts Fund with their compliments, provided by the folks back home, maybe your mother or your father. And when you write your first letter home tonight, I want you to thank them for that gift. Well, come on, fellas, let's get it.
From the reception depot, they were posted to final training units throughout the length and breadth of Britain.
The first thing I want to
By the kinds of units they were sent to, they knew where their future was to lie. Transport planes for a lucky few, flying boats for others. But for the overwhelming majority, their destination was the heavy bombers of Bomber Command, because that's where the need was greatest. Earlier in the piece, it had been the same story, different aircraft.
It's funny, when you finish your training, you know, in Canada, they ask you what your type of operation is like. And of course, the young ones want to be fighter pilots. Older ones like me want to be bomber pilots. And of course, when you get to Uxbridge, where you just sent where all the losses are, and they were to Wellingtons and Brennans. They decided to put us on to night flying, which hadn't the risks of, you know, daylight fighters getting in so on. So we went on what they called night intruders, and that had a good loss rate too, because the airfields, the fighter airfields sort of in the northwest of France and Belgium, Holland, were in the path of all our Bomber Command trips across there, so they were saturated with German night fighters. And there's one in particular, that's the Schiphol, which is the airfield at Amsterdam. That had 5 groups of night fighters on it. And our task was in a Blenheim to go there and stay an hour over that to stop night fighters taking off. It was quite hopeless. I was over there one night and got caught with 20 searchlights and 40 ACAC batteries, and I was caught in the searchlights for 25 minutes. Blenheim had 85 holes in it. I was a pilot officer when I went to West Raynham, and after my 7 trips I was a flight lieutenant, and after 15 trips I was a squadron leader, and I was leading the squadron because I was the last one left.
This area is the heart of Lichfield, the part of it best known to the thousands of men who came to train here during the war. I was always struck by the tremendous contrast of these very peaceful surroundings with the Minster Pool and the cathedral with the job we had to do over Germany.
Number 27 Operational Training Unit was located a couple of miles outside the city. They were sent here to train on Wellington 2-engine bombers in crews of 5. Who those 5 were to be, the most fateful decision of their lives, was left to chance. The Air Force let crews pick themselves.
I turned up at this empty, echoing hangar with birds chirping away in the ceiling beams. What a peculiar business. I've virtually got to propose to 6 blokes that they should come and stick their necks out and fly with me. I thought, how can I go up and ask 6 sensible, sane men to fly 30 operations with me over Germany, where there is a pretty good chance of being shot at, and well shot at?
The result of this was that chance came into it, and I think that was very fortunate indeed, because I crewed up with another fellow who also had the same feeling that this was beyond all human decision as to who would be a good man to crew with.
Losses in training were heavy. At the Empire Air Training Schools, more than 1,000 Australians were killed. A further 900 perished in accidents in the various training units of Bomber Command. Weather was one of the hazards. second-hand aircraft another, and plain inexperience the third.
When I went solo in a Wellington, then I was given 2 hours local flying. And on this morning it was rather foggy and the crows were walking along the hedges. They weren't flying, so I thought, well, you know, they should know. And I was peering out the window a bit dubiously, and the flight commander said to me, "Come on, get cracking. What do you want? Jam on it? It's a half a mile." Well, you know, we'd been used to 20 miles.
We didn't know about Murphy's Law in those days, but I think Murphy must have been there. Something happened while we go down the runway, so the pilot had to cut the motors, and we ended up in a ditch at the end. Another time we couldn't get off for some reason or another. And this time we got off, and, you know, we got up to about 100 feet, and one of the donks cut, and he popped it down on the field. Well, he didn't have much choice, actually. The mid-upper was trapped between the fire that was up about midships, and he was running backwards and forwards in the aircraft. So a couple of us went over and just pulled the turret back so they could get in, and then we all got out.
The Wellington bombers used to burn very, very fiercely, unfortunately, because of the magnesium in the metal. And there were a lot of very, very nasty accidents. I remember going out to one in particular, which crashed just near the field. And we saw bodies with just the torso left, head, arms and legs completely off. This seemed to be the case in quite a number of crashes, where there was just a torso left, like a sheep hanging up in a butcher shop, with the charred ends.
There's one other Aussie crew on the squadron, and they pranged, they went in, all killed. We were the only other Australians on the squadron, so a CO said, "Well, you better go to the funeral, all you fellas." I said, "Yeah." We said, "Yes." So they had the coffins in a Nissan hut. Nissan, you know what a Nissan hut's like, up on wooden trestles. I think the coffins were made out of butter boxes or something. And there's an Urk with a wad of waste going around the coffins, wiping up the blood that's dripping out of them. Oh, I mean, we hadn't even seen a shot fired in anger. And to see that was, ooh, you know, it stuck in my mind. Terrible.
In the whole of Bomber Command, more than 8,000 aircrew were to be killed in training. Some were buried in the country cemeteries which bordered their airfields, a long, long way from home. In 1941 and 1942, a quarter of all Australian casualties were the result of training accidents. For Bomber Command in this period, the overall rate was 17%, the lives of 1,400 young men. As a graduation exercise, the crews, while still at their training units, were sent in their ancient Wellington bombers on their very first raid into Germany. And nothing to date had quite prepared them for the reality.
It was dark and peaceful, everything was fine, and suddenly a big, very intense blue radar control searchlight just flicked across my wing and then grabbed me. And suddenly, within a second, another 20 or 30 searchlights sprang out of the ground like chutes and hooked onto me, and I just sat there with my mouth open.
Being at 9,000 or 10,000 feet, the chief armament for them was light flak, which was, used to hose pipe up. It used to come up like a hose, you know, you can imagine a stream of water, but illuminated stream of water. You could see this thing coming up and with different colours, tracer bullets. And they come up and all of a sudden they sweep back at you. And it was rather frightening, and there was plenty of it and hundreds of searchlights. And as we sort of stood outside and sort of sized it up, and I thought to myself, how the hell are you going to get through there? And a voice from down the back, he says to me, he says, "We're not going in there, are we? Think of my wife." my rear gunner. He didn't like the idea of going in. None of us did, but we had to do it.
And I went down in a series of spiral turns. The rear gunner was yelling out, it's booping all around my turret, and the front gunner was saying, keep it going. And I had nothing in my mind but to keep underneath the flak.
But the light, the searchlights and the flak, let's say light anti-aircraft fire, it was most frightening. I didn't like the idea of doing 30 of them.
30 trips was the official tour of duty, but some went down at the first hurdle. One crew had crashed on takeoff with all their bombs on board. The navigator was Joe Turnbull, with whom Don Charlwood and Max Bryant had trained. The wireless operator had been sharing a hut on the airfield with Ian Robb. The young pilot was a mate of Jeff Madden's. Before the war was over, this quiet corner of England was to be the last resting place for many, many more. Crews still in training made up a third of the force of 1,000 bombers dispatched to Cologne on the night of the 30th of May, 1942. When Sir Arthur Harris had become Chief of Bomber Command in February, it had seemed on the verge of extinction because of its lack of success. Harris changed tactics. He concentrated larger bomber forces in sharper attacks on more vulnerable targets. In March, he had set the medieval town of Lübeck ablaze. In April, he devastated Rostock. And in this, one of the greatest gambles of the war, he was committing all his aircraft and all his crews on a single night.
The bomber station commanders made his message live in every squadron which formed the gallant 1,000. The blow you strike will resound not only throughout Germany, but throughout the whole world. Let the enemy have it right on the chin. The target for tonight was Cologne and its environs, and every man went to the grim task of delivering a shot.
It devastated Cologne. About the only thing that was left was the cathedral, and whether that was by divine providence or bad bomb aiming or good bomb aiming, I'm not quite sure. It had a great effect on the morale of Britain, that raid. That was, they'd had a series of bad war news. You'll recall that Singapore had fallen, the Repulse and the Renown had been sunk, and things were pretty dreary in Britain, and the first 1,000 bomber raid certainly lifted morale. It really was a tremendous lift.
All right, pay attention to your postings, everybody. Carry on smoking.
Having had their first taste of battle and with their training complete, the crews were now posted to operational squadrons. Ahead of them lay the unappealing prospect of 29 more forays into Germany.
22 Squadron, Grafton. A453245, Sergeant Andrews, 487 Squadron, Cheddington.
The east coast of England is flat and featureless. The bomber stations that peppered it in wartime were equally so. On the 23rd of September 1942, Jeff Madden and his navigator Don Charlwood arrived at 103 RAF Squadron, Elsham Wolds in Lincolnshire. At this time, there were 4 Australian squadrons in Bomber Command, but the majority of Australians flew in British squadrons alongside British, Canadians and New Zealanders. A typical wartime airfield, its buildings were widely scattered so that a bike was essential equipment even to get to the washroom. Jeff Madden wrote in his diary, "The station's on top of an escarpment and is open to the cold winds off the North Sea and anything that may come overland from the west." But that wasn't all that made prospects bleak.
When we got there, the first question we had asked was, well, how long does it take to do 30? It was an innocent question, and we found that no one wanted to talk about it. And we said, well, when did the last crew get through? And we found that on Halifax's, no one had got through.
Aircrew were passing guests on the station, leading parallel yet utterly different lives from the permanent residents. The huge ground support staff of airmen and airwomen who kept them in the air. Some 1,000 ground crew to 200 air crew. Each station was like a small town. The permanent residents, who were there year after year, cared for their passing guests, but had to be wary of caring too much.
Girls said go, so we went to the dance together, and all at once he asked me to dance. So I said, all right, so we danced, and I have to admit, I did think, well, he has to be a better pilot than dancer, or he'd never have got his wings. And every time we stumbled, he'd say, oh, that's the Australian way, I'll have to teach you. And he walked me back to the billet. We walked up the hill, and said good night, and he said, I'll see you again. And I said, oh, no, I don't think so, thanks very much, because I really didn't want to get involved with aircrew.
An enormous amount of compassion came in with all this. You were so often asked if you would be somebody's girlfriend, and you just couldn't be. The point was, they were going out to danger all the time, and very often you knew that they wouldn't come back, but you had to go on living, and you just couldn't accept all the amorous advances that were made to you, though you felt in each instance, when very few instances were anybody unpleasant, but you felt so sad in a way.
They had a remarkable kind of mass relationship with all of us. Not only did we have individual relationships, but you had this feeling that they were very much with you, and that they, like the countryside around you, were part of life. We were dealing in death. People were dying young, but we were also dealing out death. And they, in my mind, stood for life, these girls, just as the countryside stood for life.
Well, you all know the target. It's Berlin, once more. You've got 448 aircraft on, and the attack's in 5 waves. 0 hour is 03:15. Timing is already worked out and is on the navigation board for you now.
The Air Force is depicted as, you know, carefree, you know, not a worry in the world. No, they weren't scared, and there was a lot of bloody rot. They were all scared.
In the briefing room, you don't know where you're going until they pull back that curtain. And there's a little curtain over a board, and as soon as they pulled the curtain back, there'd be dead silence.
And it's the same as it is nowadays. All the rumours you ever heard were bad ones. They were never the good ones. It was always a bad target you thought you were going to.
Just keep a lookout there. Bomb and go straight on through to position C. Then back to the south to D, and from D down to E on this long leg, you shouldn't have any difficulty at all. But you may see fighters, so keep a lookout on this leg for fighters. Keep clear of the Ruhr here. You don't want to get mixed up in those Ruhr defences. And then straightforward run across to the French coast. And from then on back to base, quite straightforward, except keep clear of London. Has anybody got any questions? Okay, well, that's all. Have a good trip.
You went back to your hut. If you had to write a few letters to people in case you didn't come back, I always had mine written. I never opened them or kept them in the same envelopes. All have different temperaments, you know, people. Some would walk around in circles. Some would lie in the grass. Some would chat to their friends. Some would stand up against the wall. They were lonely, you know, lonely people, thinking about what was going to happen.
Very often you would go to a film and then go on operations after the film. So it had to be a pretty good film to hold your attention, because you'd have interruptions occurring from time to time over the tannoy system, the loudspeaker system, and this would drown out the soundtrack of the film, and you'd realise that these announcements calling for a mechanic to such and such a place, you'd realise they were getting the aircraft bombed up.
And when you got in the bus with your 7 mates, you were all comrades, you sort of held together, but there'd be silence, there wouldn't be nobody talking. I remember a doctor telling me once that the sweat glands in the back of your neck give off an odour if you're scared. That's why dogs bite you or things like that. And that was true. You could smell, there was always that odd smell now and again in the bus. When you arrive at the plane, everybody got in except the engineer and the pilot, and we went round the plane and checked, you know, to see everything was right. Then you get in, you plug in your intercom, the pilot takes charge from that point. He takes charge. The minute you plug that thing in, his word's low. And he calls up each member, and he said, all right, boys, and we'd all say, yeah, right.
Ready for starting, Reg? Contact.
The worst time of being scared is before you take off. You get all knotted in your stomach and often you vomit before you get in the airplane. But once you get airborne and that sort of thing, you're kind of relaxed, I think. You're still tense, but you're not conscious of it.
There's the green, Skip.
For me as engineer, I always loved pulling the throttles back. When the pilot said, you know, reduce power, and he pulled it back, he knew you were safe then. And then we'd just climb around and hear the navigator say, on course in 15 seconds, Skip. And you'd turn on to the course for Germany. From then on, you never spoke. Nobody spoke except the pilot.
50 miles from the enemy coast is about the time when I alerted everybody and said, now it's on. The gunners were, of course, on the alert, and to see that no one got underneath us, I would just tip the aircraft up on one wing, and then they would tell them I was going to do this, and we'd search, and then on the other wing, and leave it for about 10 minutes and do the same thing again. Because the fighters really picked you on whether you were an easy mark or not.
Everyone in Bomber Command would feel the same way about it, I should imagine, to do a trip over Germany. You set off, you can be tormented by flak and searchlights over all the defended areas. And we get over the target, there's the risk of collision, the risk of bombs falling, which happened to me. A load of incendiaries, or some incendiaries fell on me. And all the way back, you can be tormented by the fighters, even over your own aerodrome. And you do this for a stint of 5, 3, 4 hours, and you're sitting on a bloody platform loaded with about 7,000 tons of bombs and inflammable fuel, waiting for something awful to happen to you. And you get back and land, well, you know what the feeling is then.
Are you there?
And then to call up for Pancake, permission to land, only to discover that your best mate had gone missing.
Perhaps one of the saddest times for me was when Ted Lang, one of my friends who went through on course with me here at Pierce, Cunderton and Geraldton, and he had trouble with his aircraft. He used to fly an aircraft F for Freddie, and we were BBer. And we always used to listen out for each other when you came back to see who'd come back and who hadn't come back. As you're flying around the circuit, called up for permission to land. And when I got back, there's no F for Freddie, you see. So I immediately went across the dispersal, and I said, what time did Ted get off? And they said he was 3/4 of an hour late. I said, what? He apparently had mechanical problems, and he should, we were only on the target half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, and to be on a place like Essen by herself, it was, you know, it was absolutely hopeless. He had no chance whatsoever. Anyhow, the wing commander let him take off 3/4 of an hour late.
Ted Lang's navigator was Keith Webber, a friend of Max Bryant and Don Charlwood from Canada days. Max wrote, "The third lost this week. It is not possible that such real, vibrant personalities should suddenly cease to exist. If only one of our 20 survives, all his life he will have around him the laughing shades of 19 other blokes." Within 6 months, Max too was dead. There are many dimensions of loss. To lose one of one's crew cut deeply.
I remember walking through the fields. With Bill Bancroft. And he picked up a flower. Rough chap he was. He said, "Isn't that bloody beautiful little flower?" Anyway, they're different backgrounds.
Bill Bancroft had been Philip Coffey's rear gunner. Some WAFs braved the odds and fell in love with aircrew. Jan Birch, as a young WAF officer, had become engaged to an Australian.
Colin Finch, I met, I think, at a dance. I was just engaged to Colin really for one day. It was only for one day, as it turned out, because I was phoned to say there had been an accident at the aerodrome, and perhaps I shouldn't come back that night. I could stay away a day, but I wanted to come back. I had no idea at that time. I was fearful inside, but I thought he had been injured. But when I got back to the station, I thought, well, it can't be so bad. There can't be anything so terrible, because I heard sound of music and jazz and dancing and hilarity, as there was. But somebody, because I went in, I was taken aside by a friend, a WAF officer, and told that Colin had in fact been killed. It was immediately horrifying to me, because this terrible jarring between a personal sorrow and hearing that music, which absolutely jarred. But on the other hand, I had learnt earlier that this had to go on. And after I'd gone to my room and released some of the emotion that I felt, I realized, of course, it had to be. It had to be. If one went into mourning or stopped life going on in the normal way in a station, well, you would have had no morale at all. I mean, it was the same in London and the bombing, all the cities. You couldn't just go into deep mourning because this tragedy had happened, because personal tragedies were happening all the time.
We are the boys from way down under, marching to victory.
I don't really feel that anyone in Bomber Command 1942 could feel that he was going to finish, or that he'd had any right to. Certain people said, oh yes, I'll finish, and they did. But taken by and large, I think the attitude was that, no, I won't finish, but I won't go tonight, and I won't go tomorrow night.
You'd hear some of them say, or overhear them saying, that they didn't expect to see home again. And I said, what's that? I said, well, you make your own arrangements, I'm going home. And you used to get remarks from some of these people that they'll say, oh, I can see you're going home, everyone knows you're going home, but I won't.
A few of the chaps every night used to play a record by the Ink Spots called For All You Know, We May Never Meet Again. After briefing, they played this over and over and over again until one night, one of the officers got so fed up with it after briefing that he took the record off the machine and smashed it over his knees. He didn't return from his next trip.
A dear old lady, we used to call her Mrs. Mop. She was the batwoman for this particular building. And when we went out on ops, we had an arrangement with her that we would leave our shoes outside our bedroom door when we came back as a signal to her, indicating to her that we'd got back. And we'd sometimes get in, Jim and I were in the one room, and we'd get into bed and we'd, oh, blast, we'd forgotten to put our shoes out, so we'd get up. Not that we wanted them clean, but we wanted to let Mrs. Mop know that we were back. And many a time I've seen her in tears, and poor thing, she, you know, when there were no shoes and crews had gone missing, and she had to cope with that, and it was a personal thing as far as she was concerned.
In 1942, the loss rate was averaging around 5% per operation, making it almost impossible to survive a full tour of 30. But then leave came every 6 weeks. It meant 6 days of breathing space, 6 days to live again before boarding the old bus back to battle. And for the first time, there was the whiff of victory in the air.
You could always guarantee that there were going to be a lot of friends down there, and if there weren't old friends, there were new friends to be made. So when you got down, there was a gang of us, and I think it was just let steam off. We'd live in either the regions of Strand Palace Hotel for the 6 days, and get up in the morning and meet at the cottages and drink and carry on like a lot of fools all day long. The drinking and carrying on chasing girls was the whole part of my life. I didn't even bother about food very much.
You could say that the early days of night bombing, or early nights of night bombing, were just a nuisance value, I suppose. It was dangerous enough for the people engaged in it, but it was a nuisance value. But by now, with Bomber Command building up its strength all round, we were starting to see some pretty heavy damage being inflicted on the enemy over in Holland, France, everywhere we could get to them.
The raids continued through December. Ian Robb went to Mannheim on the 6th, laid mines off Denmark on the 9th, and wrote his last letter home on the 17th. He signed it, "Love from Ian the Airman." He was killed on an operation to Munich on the 22nd. The Air Force authorities withheld the news until Christmas was over and then cabled his mother in Melbourne. She expected the telegram coming on Boxing Day to be Christmas greetings from her son. Jeff Madden wrote as the year ended, "I have no illusions as to what 1943 may bring." It was to be the start of Armageddon.
Looks okay, no, just bounces the other side of the big goalpost, through for a behind, and Richmond second behind on the scoreboard. 9-3 plays 3.
Ready, Ben?
Yes, look, been thinking. Yes. I think perhaps an apology might be in order. I hardly think you'd... From me, that is. Oh. I don't know what came over me. Well, I do, but she never turned up, you see.
Who didn't?
It's not easy, this job, you know, if you're not used to it. Menus here, soup there. Can we have another roll? What's the turbot like? I'm actually...
From the makers of the acclaimed Captain James Cook, ABC presents Peter Yeldham's The Alien Years.
I love him. Don't talk nonsense.
They were years of fierce pride.
I didn't bring her up to have some dirty, rotten, fortune-hunting hunt get his stinking hands on her. Now clear out.
And there were years of scandalous shame. A magnificent three-part Australian miniseries starring John Hargraves, Victoria Longley, and Christoph Waltz. The Alien Years premieres Tuesday night on ABC.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
I had no qualms. It didn't worry me. I was briefed on targets in which I knew that civilians must become engrossed. I was briefed on lots of targets in which we were specifically told, hit that point or don't bomb at all. But civilization, or the whole future of civilization, I believe was at stake. And I just don't think... We didn't set the code for the pattern of the war or the behaviour. That was set by Germany when they blew Warsaw over and walked across and smashed Rotterdam and Coventry and London. And it was only then that the British followed the area bombing concept. Prior to that, it had been more a direct target attack.
In 1943, Bomber Command became a weapon of increasing devastation. It had more bombers. The chief aid to marking was codenamed Oboe, a system of radio beams which could pinpoint a target with an accuracy of 300 yards when all went well. The chief of this new force of Pathfinders, as they were called, was an Australian, Don Bennett, promoted to the rank of Air Vice Marshal at the extraordinary age of 32.
Just shortly after the bomber offensive had started properly, it was discovered that things weren't being hit. And being a navigator, I was picked on to try and rectify the situation. I was running the Atlantic Ferry at the time, so I came over to England, went to the ministry and went through possibilities with them, but in particular the idea of select crews, highly trained and given the best equipment.
The other device they carried was codenamed H2S, an early form of radar which peered through the darkness to give a vague impression of the ground below. For the first major offensive of 1943, Bomber Command's chief, Sir Arthur Harris, selected the industrial towns of the Ruhr, which lay within Oboe's range. Fleets of bombers raided them night after night. On the 4th of May, Dortmund sustained nearly 700 killed. On the 29th of May, Wuppertal was destroyed. In June, it was Krefeld's turn.
To some extent, to be lacking in imagination, perhaps for a wartime pilot, is a good thing. Certainly at the time that you're doing it. You don't want to be too imaginative. You want to be fairly pragmatic, very pragmatic. And one can turn oneself into being pragmatic, even if one isn't. And you don't want to be too emotional about things, about bombing the Germans and killing them, or the Italians, or whoever it may be. You don't want to dwell on it, which I didn't, and I think very few of us did. That doesn't say that you're lacking in the basic sympathies, but you were there to do a job, and if they didn't do it, if you didn't do it to them, they were going to do it to you.
As the damage inflicted increased, so too did bomber losses. In the great fleets which filled the sky, collisions were always a hazard.
Somebody shouted, "There's a yellow marker." Of course, we all looked away. And the next minute, I saw this great big wing above my head. Because I was the flight engineer standing up, I was standing up. And we were hit just like as if it was a 3-ton truck. Bang! And then the wings, we held together for a minute, and then she scraped right across the port wing, hit the propellers. And of course, we went out of control then. Both engines burst into flames. I got thrown to the floor, banged my head. I got up, tried to get up. I could see Alan trying to get her straight. And then she dipped her nose, and I went straight down into the nose with all the junk that was on the floor. It landed on top of the bomb hammer. And all of a sudden, the nose broke off. I just saw it start to crack, and we fell out together, the bomb hammer and I. I was surrounded by bits of plane, cowlings, pieces of metal floating all around me. I don't know if you've ever stood on a bridge and watched the river, and the bridge moved and the river didn't. Well, it was the same effect there. I thought I was going up instead of the bits of metal going down. And of course I was near the target. I was right over the target. And it was horrifying, really, because I'd always wanted to escape, you know, out in the fields if I got shot down. And all the planes were coming in. I could actually see them coming in over the target like little mosquitoes. They looked, you could see line upon line of them coming in. And the place was all lit up. It was yellow light from the, you know, the fires. They were just starting, and yellow light, something like a watery sunset, that type of thing. And you could see the bombs coming down. They're all like big golden darts dropping away with the yellow light.
It was Friday, the 25th of June, target Gelsenkirchen. 29 other bombers were downed that night.
He said, climb up in the back of the truck, and up I got. And I saw these boxes there, and I sat down. It was dark, of course, you know what I mean, just a faint yellow light. And I thought, what's in the back of the truck? And I put my hand out and felt, and I came in a flying boot. And I thought, gee, that's all right. I want a pair of flying boots. And I remembered putting it on and feeling for another one. And when I put them on, all of a sudden I realised they were soaking wet. I could feel the water coming through my socks. And I felt horrible because I thought it was blood. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I was sitting on top of coffins. And I counted them. There was 5 on the top layer and 6 on the bottom. And that was I was working it out roughly. Afterwards I found out that it was 4 members of my crew, 7 of the others.
As a prisoner of war, Johnny was put in a railway compartment under Luftwaffe guard. The train's first stop was Mulheim, still smouldering from a raid the previous Tuesday. Johnny had been on that one too.
There was a Red Cross train just opposite us. It was painted white with a Red Cross on it. And there was a long ramp. It disappeared out of sight, and all of a sudden I saw these little children. They all had bandages round their eyes, and they had their hand, you know, one on each other's shoulder, with a nurse in front and a nurse behind. And they were leading them to the Red Cross train. And that's the first time that I realised, you know, what war was really like. Because it's easy when you're dropping bombs up there. And I turned to the good German. I said, where's this? And he said, Mulheim.
It happened a month later when the RAF threw in a new device to confound the German defences.
Once we dropped these windows, which were to be dropped at a given time, it upset the whole radar communications of Germany, the night fighter boys, as well as the ground defences. And there were no cones, no satellite cones, which we had experienced on all the other raids, and were always frightening. And the satellites were waving around in the sky aimlessly, lost, as it were, looking for aircraft. And of course, apparently they thought there were thousands and thousands of aircraft coming out to attack Germany. This was the effect that the metal strips had on the radar.
Window was the code name of the aluminium strips. By swamping German radar with false signals, they rendered the usual defences impotent and exposed Hamburg to catastrophe.
After working so hard to get there, from a navigation aspect, I certainly wasn't going to miss the display. Once I got there, and I always used to turn out my little navigation light and pull back the curtain and stand behind the pilot once we handed over to the bomb aimer and just look at what was going on. And you couldn't see such fire and explosions and probably explosion rings coming out of these flames and in this fire without wondering what was happening to those people down there.
It was a case of hoping that you would either be doing damage to factories, which would slow their war effort, or on the other hand, causing a certain amount of demoralisation amongst the civilian population, the army, etc. But I can still well remember that appearance of Hamburg from 150 miles out on the way home.
Hamburg was raided over 4 nights. It was the second raid on the 27th of July which did the damage. Several fires joined together in one giant conflagration which sucked in the surrounding air with terrible winds. Hayo Hermann, a Luftwaffe colonel and fighter pilot, was summoned to the scene.
I flew from Bonn to Hamburg. Then I saw already from the day before that the fires burned in the deep, and a cumulus, a grey and black cumulus, went up to 7,000 meters or 20,000 feet high. And when I circled round, I could smell it. We were all very shattered about this sort of thing. We had never seen this, and we never had did it in this manner. I cannot imagine a more humane fighting as that of a night fighter when he is over his own people and has to defend them against the intruders.
The consequences of the attack were appalling. Nothing like it was to happen again until Dresden and Hiroshima in 1945. Nobody had planned the firestorm. The weather was unusually hot, the city unusually dry, the bombing unusually concentrated. To this day, nobody knows precisely how many died, but estimates vary from between 40 to 60,000. The chiefs of the command celebrated Hamburg as a great victory, but even they were unaware until much later of the horrific details of that night. For the ordinary men of bomber aircrew, it had been a trip like any other. One more number chalked up towards the magic 30, which would finish their tour and see them still alive.
Over a target, all one sees is a swirl of smoke and a pattern of streets, and it did come to us from time to time. Yes, there are humans there, but then that would be swept away by our own fears, by our own need to concentrate very, very hard on what we were doing. But sometimes as we turned away and you got out of the target area, a thought would come to you, well, I wonder what we've done. But you couldn't afford to let that get at you, because, as I saw it, our first loyalty was to the crew. You must never let down the chaps that you were with. You must get them back.
The next battle was to be for Berlin. Harris conceded that it might take weeks and cost the Air Force 500 bombers, but he promised Churchill that he would wreck the German capital from end to end, and it would cost Germany the war. The route to victory, which Harris proposed, was a hard road for his crews. 1,150 miles to journey, weighed down with bombs, fuel loads stretched to their limits, flak and fighters waiting the length of the way. But buoyed up by Hamburg, Churchill did more than take Harris's advice. He declaimed it as propaganda.
We averaged the same as the main force, around about 3% or 4%. The only exception to that was when a gentleman called Winston Churchill decided that he was going to show the Hun that he could do what he liked when he liked, and said, we are coming to Berlin, and we are coming without surprise. And in the period of 14 trips that we did on Berlin in that series, I lost 1.5 times my whole strength, which was not funny.
For night after night, crews went out into the darkness, 4 hours into the target and 4 hours out again. The Battle of Berlin dragged on through the autumn and winter of 1943 and the beginning of the spring of 1944. Harris had underestimated the campaign's length and, more seriously, the cost to his own force. Although flak still took a heavy toll, it was the German fighters which wreaked most havoc. The experience of Hamburg had reshaped the Luftwaffe's expectations too. Window had made their system of ground radar control obsolete, so German fighters were now released to roam and seek out victims using their own radar in their aircraft. Most bombers, outpaced, outmaneuvered and outgunned, scarcely knew what hit them. Hajo Hermann even threw day fighters into the fray, ordering searchlights to light up the cloud base while he dropped flares above the bomber stream. The lumbering dark shapes of the bombers stood out like flies on a white tablecloth.
We did lose a lot of aircraft during that period. But we did take the battle right home to where they never thought we would be able to take it home and survive the losses.
Even as early as August 1943, Bomber Command had lost 56 aircraft in one night's raid to Berlin, its heaviest defeat so far in the war. In January 1944, the German night fighter pilots surpassed their previous success. More than 1,047 heavy bombers destroyed against Japan. As for Berlin itself, it had been fearfully damaged. It had not been destroyed. People went on with their lives, just as they had in London during the Blitz. Luftwaffe fighters continued to triumph. The bomber's best defense against them was always the vigilance of its gunners, isolated in their lonely turrets, and in the case of the tail gunners, exposed to the frost-biting dark.
As an air gun, you just have to sit and look at the sky and move your turret from side to side, looking around. And sometimes you think a star was a fighter. Then all the way across the channel you have people shooting at you. One of the most fascinating things was that if you looked down over France or Holland or one of those countries, you'd see all these little lights blinking from the top of houses. And the people in those countries were actually taking the risk of getting on the top of their roofs and flashing V for victory signs on their torches.
Our greatest concern of discomfort, of course, was the cold. One found on the very cold flights that at the bottom of your oxygen mask, the ice used to build up, and now and again you would break that off. If your electrical suit worked favourably, that was great. But I do recall one trip when we went to Stuttgart, and this electrical suit that I was wearing overheated on the left side and didn't work down the right side. And I left the suit on because I didn't want to be completely frostbitten. And in fact, going over the target, I was clapping my hands to keep the circulation going, which it wasn't through enthusiasm of being over the top of Stuttgart at the time.
And we were always taught as air gunners, we were given this crazy message in those days that if you ate a lot of carrots, your night vision would improve. So we lived after the war on carrots. And after the war, when we started to look like rabbits, they said that it didn't mean anything.
The other defense was tactics. The map is of a raid to Frankfurt in Germany's center. The first leg out to point A shows the bomber stream headed for Stettin or Berlin. The change of course at A indicates Hanover or the Ruhr as likely targets, but with Berlin still a possibility. At B, as the main stream turns south, 12 Mosquito light bombers shower masses of window on the track from Hanover to Berlin. The Luftwaffe would only be certain Berlin was a diversion minutes before the main force reached Frankfurt, its true objective. Everything went wrong on the night of the 30th of March 1944 when the main force was sent to Nuremberg, deep into Germany.
We laid down the usual tactics, diversions, raids by the Mosquito force to take the enemy fighters away and so on, in the usual way, and everybody was happy. But by midday, the Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Thornby, rang me up and said, the CNC wants to overrule your plans for the day. He thinks that AOC 5 Group should have a chance of proving that he is right. He wants to go straight in and straight out. And so I immediately burst a blood vessel and said, well, that's just crazy, because it's a clear moonlight night. The casualty rate will be enormous. Oh, no, he doesn't think so, and he'd like to try it. And I said to the boys, look, it's on for young and old tonight. Now, just keep your eyes on the sky, because they started to fall, as I say, within 20 minutes anyway, or probably less than that, 10 minutes of crossing the coast. And from then to the target, the air was not only was a good visibility, but it seemed to be bright. The moon was really shining brightly, although it wasn't a full moon. I was first back at Waddington, and I was called up to the control tower by Sir Ralph Cochrane, and he said, well, how did it go? And I said, Jerry got a century before lunch today, and he didn't quite, he got 96.
At that time,
it was the beginning of the round-the-clock bombing, as they called it. And some days there were 50 and 60 aircraft missing. And I'd think, oh, you know. And then on the Tuesday morning, there were only 9 aircraft missing. And I said to my mother, thank goodness, only 9 aircraft missing today. Norman will be safe. I'll see him tomorrow. Well, in the event, the telegram didn't come, and I sort of had this feeling that something was wrong. So I said, I'm going to ring him up, because I knew the number. And I got straight through to the sergeant's mess. And I said, is Flight Sergeant Thomas there, please? And some young pilot or someone had answered me, and he said, oh, he's missing from Monday night's raid. And I just said, oh. And he said, oh my God, who are you? And I said, I'm his fiancée. And he said, I thought you were the telephone operator. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything. And I said, oh, that's all right. Do you know any details? And he said, no, I'm sorry, I don't. So I said, oh, thanks very much. And I just hung up because I thought, well, it might be his turn tomorrow. He was obviously very embarrassed. But after about 4 days, I could hear his voice in my head all the time saying, I'm all right, Joycey, fair dinkum. He taught me fair dinkum. And all the time I could hear, I'm all right, Joycey, fair dinkum. And I spoke to my father, and he said, well, look, he's got a 50-50 chance. Don't bank too much on it.
Jan Birch, having previously lost a fiancé, married another Australian, Brian Reed. He always phoned her when he came back.
I waited and waited, and the whole place emptied. And I sat there and I thought, I'll wait a few more minutes. I'll wait a few more minutes looking down at my watch. And there was no call. And I suddenly thought, well, I've just got to go back now. But that, I can feel just a cold, empty feeling. And if you've been through something when you've worried and then things haven't gone badly, you then talk yourself into it. Don't be stupid, you know. This, you know, it's just a small things happened. He couldn't ring. And as I got outside, these older WAF officer, section officer, Moneypenny, she was a funny character, but she was very warm-hearted and very kind to me. And she came and she said, oh, Jan, would you cycle over to me to the MO, medical officer? He wants to see you. And afterwards I realized those friends of mine and those people on the station, nobody really could face telling me. I felt so sorry for them afterwards, because they had been sort of part of that marriage. And I went into the Doc Rogers, and he said, Jan, I've got to prepare you for something. He said, Brian and the crew didn't return. I can even now feel the cold inside me. I don't know what I said. I don't think, I couldn't cry, I couldn't do anything. I think I said, oh no, but it isn't possible. It wouldn't happen twice. And I remember cycling down this lane, getting off my bike and going into the woods. And that feeling of being surrounded by beauty and solitude, which wasn't sad in a way, because amongst all the grass under the trees were these windflowers, I call them wood anemones, I think they're called. And they were just like a cloud of white, delicate things blowing in the wind. And I felt, well, it isn't all in vain. Whatever's happened, whatever has gone wrong, life does go on. There's, Brian would feel that. Colin would feel that. The other boys I knew would feel that. And so I felt, not that I mean to say that was a sudden solution to all my problems, but it remained with me as a comfort.
Through 1943 to 1944, Bomber Command's total losses reached 16,000 aircrew. How did men endure it?
Once you got onto a bomber squadron, they reckoned that a crew hadn't paid for itself until they paid for its training until they did at least 5 trips. And anyhow, you couldn't get out of it, even though you probably would have wanted to get out of it after the first trip, because they had a clause called LMF, which meant lack of moral fibre. And if you declared that, you were stripped of your rank and your buttons and your flying brevet, and you'd imagine for the rest of your life you'd have LMF tattooed across your head and people would call you yellow, but you'd sooner get killed than have that LMF brand on you.
You know, in a way, it was a fate worse than death, I suppose, to have that stigma attached to you. And there was great mystery about it. You didn't know what happened. You knew that fellows who were declared lacking in moral fibre were stripped of their rank and given menial tasks to do or spirited away from the station. But where they went, I was never sure.
It was possible to brand people or to get something to rub off that looked like LMF in cases where there were genuine people had returned from operations for a genuinely good reason. For example, if your intercom failed, as it might 100 miles out, particularly in damp weather, you can't, you get these shorts, and then you come back and about within 50 miles of home, the thing comes on again. Now, next day, you can't prove that it went off, so someone says, LMF.
I turned back with an aircraft that was, like I said, uncontrollable. The flight commander the next morning had it tested, he said, and that there was nothing wrong with it, and I was to take it up and test it with a full bomb load on. Well, fortunately, before that, one of the airmen had leaned against the tailplane, and the whole thing had moved. It had been come out from servicing, and it hadn't been tightened up properly. And that flight commander never apologised to me, and I don't think I ever spoke to him ever again. But they were things that, you know, you were scared, but you didn't want to show it, or didn't want anyone to tell you that you were a dingo.
And all I used to say was that anybody who's been through what they have to go through should never be branded a coward, even if he did fail, because he had failed only under extreme stress.
But to most Australians at home, the war in Europe was remote. They required a gesture to remind them it was happening.
Across the Pacific to Australia flies a giant Avro Lancaster bomber. Its all-Australian crew lands the 27-ton aircraft at Sydney after a record long-distance flight. 19 aircraft like this formed the task force which shattered the Mona and Ida dams. The Governor-General and Lady Gowrie welcomed the Lancaster's crew, led by the captain, 22-years-old Flight Lieutenant Peter Isaacson of Melbourne.
I can't say how very pleased we are. We're back in Australia.
I had a complaint from some of our aircrew personnel that they were receiving letters from home, from parents, relatives and friends, asking them when they were returning to where the real war was.
There were reports in the papers of airmen being sent white feathers from Australia, indicating that they were, shouldn't be there, that they should be back in Australia, that we were shirking our responsibilities.
I took the matter up with the Minister for Air on a short visit that he made to Britain, and got absolutely no satisfaction from him. In fact, when I drew his attention to this matter, he just told me point blank that he didn't believe me. So I produced several letters with the white feathers, and he didn't even condescend to read one of the letters. Air Ministry and the RAF appreciated the RAAF effort. The question of Australians appreciating it, I don't think they did appreciate it.
For those who had sons or brothers there, it was another matter. Brian Moorhead had survived 4 years of war and had risen to be gunnery leader of number 463 Australian Squadron.
My mother rang me when she got the telegram, and then she told me that she had the telegram that he was missing. He was missing for a year, and then she didn't speak to me, and so I came home, of course, but then she was unconscious on the floor. And she always thought through the whole of that year that he was alive and a prisoner of war. But, you know, I knew he wasn't. But the whole time that he was flying, that you're living it, you've got to go through it to know what it's like, really, I think. You're at constant tension because you're reading about people being killed all the time, and you think, well, you know, with the danger they go through, they were flying nearly every night.
Dear Mrs. Moorhead, it is with the most heartfelt grief that I now confirm the tragic news that your son, Flight
And those
Lieutenant
letters
Brian Moorhead,
are really frightful to receive. They really are. You know, they're very sympathetic, and they're very well written and couched in very sympathetic terms, but they're hard to read. They really are.
Brian Moorhead had been killed as the bomber offensive reached its peak just before and after the Allied invasion of Europe. Bomber Command attacked oil plants, gun emplacements, railway and road links to the front, and still maintained its raids on German cities. The tonnage of bombs dropped increased fourfold on the previous year to a massive 525,000 tons. Meanwhile, the 2nd Tactical Air Force had been formed under the command of Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry. It had been hived off from Bomber Command in 1943 to take on special tasks.
In the Tactical Air Force, you didn't have a dreary time because some of the targets we had were fascinating. For example, in Brest Harbour, they bought the ocean-going U-boat crews that were out for 6 months. They brought them in there to revictual and refuel and so on. And to give the crews a break, they sent them to a chateau about 60 miles in from Brest. Lovely big chateau for a week's holiday. And the Special Air Service troops, the English SAS Army, used to be dropped inside France and wander around and do this and that. They found the chateau, and they're having a party on a Saturday night. 160 German U-boat crews and about 150 nice French ladies. So they told Basil, and he said, well, we're bombing at 6 in the morning. So we went over and we bombed out of this place, flattened it at 6 in the morning, killed the lot. You see, that has satisfied you because you couldn't get the U-boats at sea. They were under 12 foot of concrete at Brest Harbour. They tried to get them there.
If the Tactical Air Force were the cavalry, the crews of Bomber Command remained the poor bloody infantry of the air.
I can remember going into the target, which was a very hot target, and with a hell of a lot of flak and searchlights and night fighters outside. And I saw a big piece of flak heading up towards where I was sitting. Next thing I knew, I'm in a forest, covered with blood and broken hip, or cracked hip. I was in a very bad state. In fact, I had my whole face was ripped off. I had to have a form of plastic surgery after it. And you can imagine, I didn't have a clue where I was. I thought, God, the last thing I know was bombing the Krupp's works, and here I'm in a forest. And it was pouring rain, so I remember the edict we'd been given to walk by night and hide by day, so I just hid under this, hid under trees and things like this, and smoked cigarettes in my hand and chewed the gum and didn't know what the hell to do. I could hardly walk. And I thought, well, I'll have to try and, if this is somewhere near Essen, I'll head out that way and perhaps I can get somewhere near the British front lines or the Allied front lines. And I used to crawl along the ground. I don't know how far I went. I think I kept going around in circles. But on the second morning, I think this happened for about 36 hours or something like this. On the second morning, I heard an aircraft coming in low. And I saw it was looked up and I saw it was a British Beaufighter. I saw the direction it was heading and I started crawling in that way. In fact, I picked up a stick and tried to limp along on the stick. And through the mist, I saw an enormous Germanic-looking castle. And then at the side of it was an old man digging what appeared to be, or did prove to be, early onions. He was raking them or hoeing them. So I'll crawl up to this old bloke. So I crawled up to him, and he didn't hear me or didn't see me. I don't know how, but he was too concentrated on the onions. And I pulled a big knife from out of my flying boot and put it in his ear. And I said to him, reading off a language card, which had about 4 different languages on. In German, where am I? In French, where am I? In Dutch, where am I? In the end, I said, you stupid old bastard, where am I? And he said, thee be a Norfolk lad. He said, yon is King's Lynn. So what had happened, I was probably the only bloke in the war who didn't escape an invasion around England. We'd been hit over Essen. When I was hit underneath the turret and knocked unconscious in the turret. Apparently we had an engine shot out. Another one was burning, or nearly burning. And having dropped the bombs, the pilot headed back over the channel. But because the plane couldn't make height, it iced up. And when it iced up, it couldn't get over, we just got over the channel, and it crashed into an enormous oak tree on the huge estate in England called Houghton Park, which was owned by the British Lord High Chancellor, Lord Cholmondeley. And the plane hit this enormous oak tree, and it had a stray bomb on it. And the bomb went off, and my turret was blown as a unit to something like a mile away from the rest of the plane, which burnt immediately, and all my 6 friends were burnt to death. And I was flung in the turret. I landed somewhere on the top of a tree because later on they found my unopened parachute and harness in the tree. And I'd fallen out of the tree, and that's where I woke up in the forest.
In 4 months of 1945, 181,000 tons of bombs rained down on Germany, more than twice as many as Bomber Command had dropped in the entire first 3 years of the war. Many of the targets were military, but cities were still being hit, and some, such as Würzburg, for no apparent reason. The command had become a runaway juggernaut. However, one of the last attacks was at least of symbolic significance. On Anzac Day, the 25th of April, 1945, 20 Lancasters from number 460 Australian Squadron were among the force which bombed Hitler's Eagle's Nest Chalet and the nearby SS barracks at Berchtesgaden in the Harz Mountains. 8 days later, the war in Europe was over. Immediately, the Lancasters were refitted to bring home prisoners of war, 24 men in every aircraft.
It was quite emotional. The first plane that landed with the prisoners, we were all crowding around looking, and these men, they were big high planes, you know, the Lancasters, and they came down the steps, and the first man down got down on his knees and kissed the ground, and it was just so emotional.
Among the hundreds of aircrew prisoners flown out was Johnny Johnston, returning to his native Scotland, his wife, and his father's gamekeeper's cottage.
It's funny what you think about when you're going home. It was dark when we were coming down the hill over the Scottish border in the train, and I remember I had my eyes closed, and I could tell where I was by the swing of the train or the rock of the track, and you know the noise it makes, and that was coming home, yeah. And of course my father and them were all there to meet me, but they had sort of a big party arranged for me. But somehow, you know, I didn't want that. I just wanted to be alone. And we had a beautiful estate I lived on, so I went down by the river, sat in the seat, you know, thought about all the things that had gone on in the war.
After VE Day, they decided they'd take the ground crews over to have a look at the damage, assess it, you know, have a look at the damage. They'd never been over there, and Well, we ourselves had never been over there in the daytime. I was on night operations, and we flew down through the Bure and got over the Bure. Well, the Bure was one unholy mess. It was just absolutely devastated. You'd see a block of buildings and you'd think, oh, there's some have been missed over there, and you'd fly over. They just burnt out shells. And surrounding the towns, this great area, I suppose, for a mile and a half on the outskirts of the towns, are just these pockmarked with the bomb craters where this area bombing, you know, some made the target and some didn't. And there's this great areas of ploughed fields. And up around Hamburg and that, and we could see I think it was one of the pocket battleships was upside down in Kiel Harbour. You could see this ship laying upside down, but it was complete devastation. And I thought to myself at the time, God, you know, look what we've done to this country.
It was a most depressing day to see these lovely fine old buildings of something I've always admired. And what a fine old city it must have been before all this utter destruction. And we come away very depressed. We certainly weren't happy people.
It was a Europe and a war which they were glad to leave behind them, to sail into the sunshine again.
We came back through Panama Canal, as a matter of fact, which was an eye-opener. And we got to Sydney Harbour just on dusk. And because Sydney, by then, all the brownouts gone, it was lit up and so forth. But they didn't dock the darn boat till the next day, and we were out in the middle of the harbour, you know. Plenty of money and nowhere to go. Yes, it was lovely to see that.
And I imagine myself on a great big white ship like the Orion or something, coming into Sydney Harbour with the ferries tooting and so forth. But it didn't work that way. I finished Staff College in America. The day they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, that's the day we graduated. I was being flown home, and I was in San Diego when VJ Day occurred, so we stayed there one day. And then flew direct from San Diego to Hawaii, to Cocos, Suva and home, and arrived in just about dusk in Sydney. Nobody knew I was coming. The only fellow who took any interest in me was the customs man who had a little look in the bag I had. And I walked out of what was the old Aero Club building in Mascot. And there I was back in Sydney, and nobody met me. So I went and got a cab and went up to the Great Southern Hotel and had a lamb chop. That was my coming home.
It was a sea of faces. And of course my husband would be quite alone on his, you know, right at the end. I saw him before he saw me, and the rest of the girls knew. I said, there he is. And they said, call out. Now, I couldn't. I don't know. I just couldn't. I felt overwhelmed in some way. Mm. And then they all called out, and next minute he was there. And he just grabbed me and swung me round and round, and that was the end of it. No more letters, you know. It was just wonderful to be there.
The euphoria was immediate. But then for many came a sense of being adrift, displaced from the experience they had endured.
The hardest part was being amongst people who didn't understand through no fault of their own. I was the eldest of 6 kids and 3 younger brothers, and there was a gap of about 10 years. They couldn't understand. I mean, they wanted to ask me a lot of questions that I didn't feel like answering. My parents didn't understand, and how could they? So you tended to congregate with the people who did understand, and all you did was recount all of the things that happened and get nervy and, you know, and drink again.
I still have bad times. I still have nightmares. I still think of, you know, of the past, and I still suffer physically and mentally as a result of what I went through. It's hard to tell people that, but I do.
Yes, I sometimes wonder now
I wonder what damage I've done today.
Many of them are the product of stress. Many of them suffered by decorated airmen who forced themselves through their tour, or sometimes tours of duty, at a cost that they didn't know was to come. And I know men now who their lives have been literally shattered for the whole of their existence since the war. What they need is someone to support them, someone to tell them that their major right and duty is to walk tall. Some of them don't, and they should.
I think that there's more hope possibly for the world in the revulsion in Britain toward Bomber Command than if the British were in fact saying, well, they had it coming to them, fair enough, we're glad it happened. Now this, I think this would be a much more, something to be much more concerned about than having a revulsion to what we did. Okay, we've been disowned to a certain degree, but maybe that's something in a way that we fought for. And when one goes to England nowadays, the Australians and the Canadians and the New Zealanders have to line up with their passports, and the Germans and the Italians file straight through. Maybe we fought for that too. At least that signifies that they're not likely to be at each other's throats again.
Tuesday night, the premiere of Peter Yeldham's The Alien Years, a major new three-part miniseries.
Thank you. What a wonderful, warm, terrific audience. Crawl, crawl, blah, blah. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, I'd like to get the ball rolling tonight in traditional Tonight Show style by having...